over the course of these 3 days, I gather that you will be discussing China studies from different perspectives. This will include developments within China, matters pertaining to India-China relations, obviously, China's ties with the rest of the world, and our own understanding of that society. Now, these deliberations will be academic in large part, but policy-oriented in some respects, perhaps sometimes both at the same time. There is no question that we need to invest more deeply in the study of China. Its salience in the global order is self-evident, and recent decades, if anything, have only heightened that prominence. That it is a proximate neighbor of India only makes stronger studies an even more compelling case. The two nations, of course, have some similarities, especially of size and of history. But they're also a very interesting contrast in many ways, whether you think of it culturally, politically, or economically. Both are in the process of building a modern nation state from a civilizational society. And their parallel rise in the contemporary era, albeit at a differential pace and intensity, that is actually a relatively unique happening in human history. In short, there is much for all of you to research, to reflect on, and to assess in this particular domain. Now, from a policy perspective, it is naturally to our advantage that there is solid expertise on China in India. Indeed, this very assumption has led us in the Ministry of External Affairs to set up a dedicated study center on China. But that said, let me also accept that there is something much broader than a strategic requirement. As both India and China have grown in recent decades, it was inevitable that we would have much more to do with each other. We have seen that expressed in trade and in finance, in tourism and culture, and indeed, as we are seeing just now, in think tanks and the academia as well. Exchanges in all domains are obviously facilitated by a more informed understanding of the polity and society with which we are dealing. But while policy itself may benefit from a wider pool of expertise and talent, it is equally necessary that the world of China studies also has a sound grasp of policy. After all, by defining opportunities and challenges clearly, that will not only influence your insights, but perhaps even help shape better your own expectations. Now, all of you are familiar with the modern history of our bilateral ties. Now, perhaps not everyone may know every nuance of how they evolved, but I think generally people have a sense of, the difficulties as well as the development of this relationship. After the 1962 conflict, we exchanged ambassadors only in 1976. The first prime ministerial visit to China after 1954 actually happened only in 1988. And indeed, the rebuilding of our ties was actually a very painstaking and arduous endeavor. Now, this, if you think about it, this is something of a paradox because do remember that India was among the early nations to actually recognize the People's Republic of China. So what you can see is that the quality of our ties in many ways was impacted both by the border conflict and the lost decades thereafter. And it is, so in many ways we had to kind of orchestrate a sense of recovery thereafter. Now, there's also a strategic explanation for this, given how close China was, in contrast to India, I should add, to the West in this period. Nevertheless, for the last 3 decades, interactions and exchanges grew steadily in many areas. China became one of our largest trading partners. a very significant source of investment, even of technology, a participant in projects and infrastructure building, and a very substantial destination for tourism and education. As for the border areas, a complex but practical set of understandings and agreements focused on their management, even as negotiations were conducted on the boundary dispute. Now, for all the differences and disagreements that we may have had on the boundary, the central fact was that border areas still remained fundamentally peaceful. The last loss of life before 2020 was, in fact, as far back as 1975. That is why the events in eastern Ladakh last year have so profoundly disturbed the relationship. Because they not only signaled a disregard for commitments about minimizing troop levels, but also showed a willingness to breach peace and tranquility. Especially to an audience like yours that is so focused on China, I don't really have to remind you what impact this has had on both public and political opinion in our country. Significantly, to date, we have yet to receive a credible explanation for the change in China's stance or reasons for massing of troops in border areas. The fact is that the development of our ties can only be based on mutuality. Indeed, the three mutuals, mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, and mutual interest, are its determining factors. Any expectation that they can be brushed aside and that life can carry on undisturbed despite the situation at the border, that's simply not realistic. There are discussions underway through various mechanisms on disengagement at the border areas. But if ties are to steady and progress, policies must take into account the learnings of the last 3 decades. Experience of the past taught us the importance of stabilizing our relationship even while adjusting to changes. From that, we can seek proper guidance that will be to the benefit of both nations. Now, these can be summed up by 8 broad propositions. First and foremost, agreements already reached must be adhered to in their entirety, both in letter and spirit. Second, where the handling of the border areas are concerned, the LAC must be strictly observed and respected. Any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo is completely unacceptable. Third, peace and tranquility in the border areas is the basis for development of relations in other domains. If they are disturbed, so inevitably will the rest of the relationship. Now, this is quite apart from the issue of progress in the boundary negotiations. Fourth, while both nations are committed to a multipolar world, there should be a recognition that a multipolar Asia is one of its essential constituents. Fifth, obviously, each state will have its own interests, concerns, and priorities, but sensitivity to them cannot be one-sided. At the end of the day, relationships between major states are reciprocal in nature. Sixth, as rising powers, each will have their own set of aspirations and their pursuit too cannot be ignored. Seventh, there will always be divergences and differences, but their management is essential to our ties. And eighth, civilizational states like India and China must always take the long view. It has often been said that the ability of India and China to work together will determine the Asian century. At this time, it is equally important to recognize that the difficulties in doing so may well undermine it. The India-China relationship is today truly at a crossroads. Choices that are made will have profound repercussions, not just for the two nations, but for the entire world. Respecting the three mutuals and observing those 8 propositions, those 8 principles that I spoke about, they will surely help us make the right decisions.